Welcome to the Roundtable series entitled Russia's Aggression Against Ukraine, What is at stake? It's our first roundtable in this series organized by the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. My name is Alexander Pankeev. I'm the editor-in-chief of Forum for the Ukrainian Studies, the project of Contemporary Ukraine Studies program at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. Today we will have designated scholars at our institute who will be speaking about the situation in Ukraine and providing the analytical information, whatever it is possible, to explain the crisis that is unfolding right now in Ukraine and possible responses from around the globe, and also historical perspectives to this problem. I'm transferring the floor for opening this roundtable to Dr. Natalia Hanenko-Friesen, the director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies.
Thank you, Alexander. Greetings to everybody in the room today. Greetings from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. On February 24, yesterday at 5 a.m. Kyiv time, the armed forces of Russian Federation launched a massive and ferocious invasion of Ukraine. The Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta has been closely following the developments in Ukraine, and especially so since actually the beginning of the Russian occupation of Ukrainian territories in 2014. We're back to be actively engaged as academics in what is going on right now around the world. Established in 1976, CIUS has accumulated substantive knowledge about Ukraine and possesses therefore globally recognized expertise in all areas related to the study of Ukraine and also its relations with other nations and cultures. Our scholars have commented on past tragedies and acts of aggression in this part of the world, such as the famine of 1932-33, known as Holodomor, World War II, the Chernobyl disaster of 1986, the annexation or occupation of Crimea in 2014, and others. So while the world is glued to the TV and computer screens in disbelief, and while we are all inundated with and have to process the incumbent information about the ongoing developments on the ground in Ukraine, the important question that we should not forget to always keep in mind is the question, why? Why this attack? Why Putin's Russia is invading Ukraine? Why is Putin threatened by Ukraine? It is an important question to remember to ask, as it invites us all not to forget what is at stake in this global and raveling crisis, as the military aggression against Ukraine is simultaneously an assault on democracy and all the democratic values we have been inspiring to live by since the end of the World War II. And those are the values that Ukraine embraced during its development as a sovereign nation since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. We are well equipped here at the Institute to address this question and offer critical and fact-based answers and perspective on what is going on. As Alexander had pointed out, we are inviting you today to the Blitz roundtable about those key issues that have been defining the conflict, the geopolitical conflict we're all in right now, that has Ukraine in its core. We invite you to specifically pay attention to those issues such as democracy, sovereignty, disinformation, Ukrainian-Russian relations at the beginning of it all, and civic society. We also invite general public and media exactly to embrace these issues and to pay attention to them as they are at the core of the conflict. I am now passing on the word to Tanya Stech-Plavushchak and my colleague at the Institute who will be moderating this event.
Thank you. As Alexander said, this is the CIUS Roundtable, Russia's War Against Ukraine, What is at Stake? Hello, my name is Tanya Plavushchak-Stech, and I'm a senior scholarly editor, writer, and translator at the Toronto office of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, or CIUS. I would like to open today's roundtable by introducing our panelists. You just heard from Professor Natalia Hanenko-Friesen. As Alexander said, Professor Hanenko-Friesen is the director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. She is a professor in the Department of Modern Languages and Cultural Studies and Hutzulak Chair of Ukrainian Culture and Ethnography at the University of Alberta. She is a distinguished specialist in cultural anthropology. We also have Professor Volodymyr Kravchenko, who is a professor of history in the Department of History, Classics, and Religion at the University of Alberta. He is a former director of the CIUS and currently directs the Contemporary Ukraine Studies Program and the Kowalski Program at the CIUS. Professor Frank Sisson is the director of the Peter Jacek Center for Ukrainian Historical Research at the CIUS. He is also the editor-in-chief of the Hrushevsky Translation Project and the head of the CIUS Toronto office. He is a leading specialist on the history of early modern Ukraine and other vital areas of Ukrainian history. Dr. Marko Robert-Stech is a literary scholar and award-winning writer. He is the director of the CIUS Press and scholarly publications, including the Internet Encyclopedia of Ukraine. One of his specialties is the history and current state of Ukrainian culture. And last but not least, we have Dr. Alexander Pankeyev. He introduced himself, but I will repeat. He is the editor-in-chief of Forum for Ukrainian Studies at the Contemporary Ukrainian Studies Program at the CIUS. Dr. Pankeyev is a historian whose main research interests include the history of the steppe, that is southern Ukraine, and Russia-Ukraine relations. I will address my first question to Professor Kravchenko. We begin our discussion today by delving into the complex and multifaceted issue of Ukrainian-Russian relations. Volodymyr, given your expertise, can you share with us your insights into the deeper underlying reasons for the nature of the current relations between Ukraine and Russia?
Thank you, Tanya. I believe that many of you heard the Russian President Putin when he fed the world with his vision of history. He seems to be really obsessed with history and geopolitics. I'm not going to analyze his words and texts and mimics. All I'm trying to say is that Ukrainian-Russian relations cannot be understood properly without history. We need to understand intellectual, historical, and geopolitical dimension of this war. So my first point is, we are witnessing a prolonged agony of the Soviet symbolic space and its gradual nationalization by Ukraine and Russia. In fact, both countries are still in the process of intensive nation-state building. For each of them, the issue of identity is of paramount importance. The difference between the two is also obvious. President Putin is an embodiment of Russian imperial nationalism and fundamentalism. President Zelensky, of Jewish and Soviet background, is anything but Ukrainian integral nationalist or Banderevets. He is focusing on Ukrainian political, not ethnic nation-state building. I saw recently and read many insightful and well-informed observers, but most of them somehow overlook the identity dimension in what is going on between Russia and Ukraine now. It's because many of them believe that the era of nationalism is over. It is not. My second point is that any nation building is directly connected to a war, like it or not. I am afraid, it may sound cynically, but most modern nations are the products of a war, or a war mythology at least, from Great Britain and France to Germany and Russia. My third point is that from historical perspective, Ukrainian-Russian relations are very special. That explains why Putin is so angry with Ukraine. He is not angry with, let's say, Estonia or Finland. His attitude to Georgia or Azerbaijan is motivated by purely geopolitics. However, in case of Ukraine and Belarus, he denies the very existence of their respective separate identities. He doesn't deny Estonian or Georgian identities. It brings me to the next point of Ukrainian nation building. What is so special about Ukraine? Why it took so long for Ukraine, compared to Baltic former Soviet republics, to find her geopolitical place in the world and geopolitical orientation to the West? The answer, I believe, is simple. It's because Ukraine was so deeply incorporated into the Russian world and Soviet world for such a long time. These two worlds are overlapped, but they are different, to some degree at least. And it begs for the next question. Do we really believe that Ukraine managed to become truly consolidated and separate nation after many years of uncertainty? I think that Ukraine managed to settle a score, so to say, with her communist past after 2014. It looks like it can do the same with her Russian imperial past after this war. And Mr. Putin contributed greatly to both of these processes. This war can become the most effective tool of Ukrainian nation building. However, there are some important problems to be resolved. Russian language, the Russian Orthodox Church, and Russian imperial and Soviet historical legacies. And of course, Ukraine badly needs a new social contract to become fully consolidated and fully independent nation. Historians have a very long memory and they love analogies. I cannot resist this temptation, even though any historical analogy is highly risky enterprise. Let us imagine or recall the region which is known under the title Eastern Europe. Back to the past, we can see the same geopolitical actors, Russia, Poland, Turkey, and so to say Europe, whatever it means. Ukraine is a key to East European historical region. Whoever controls Ukraine controls the entire eastern periphery of Europe. And Ukrainian history contains a record of many Ukrainian-Russian wars. It teaches those who are ready to be taught that Ukrainians can win the battle, but very often they lose the war. And to be victorious, Ukraine needs allies. Speaking of recent history, I'm afraid the current situation reminds me of 1917, 1918 years, when the Russian army captured Kyiv and forced Ukraine to give up part of its sovereignty. Finland managed to stop Soviet-Russian military invasion 3 times, from 1918 to 1944, but the price for that was very high, as you know. I always thought that Ukrainian-Russian relationship is the central topic in Ukrainian modern history. I wish it was included into the Institute's priorities. 2 years ago, we prepared 2 books on the history, geography, and current state of Ukrainian-Russian borderland, and I'm waiting for them to be published. Thank you.
Thank you, Volodymyr. Perhaps some other panelists would like to address these issues as well. Frank?
Having been involved with the Hrushevsky project for as long as I have, I of course wondered whether either Mr. Putin, which I doubt, or those around him who provided information for his text, had ever looked at the text of Hrushevsky and engaged it, I think, fully. One of the experiences we have had at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies is we have tried over a considerable amount of time to somehow stimulate Russian-Ukrainian encounters and discussions. Beginning in the 1980s, when the Soviet Union still existed, then after the fall of the Soviet Union, together with the Humboldt Stiftung and the National Endowment for Humanities financed projects where we ran conferences on the Russian-Ukrainian encounter. And what we found out at that time, it was too early, largely from the Russian side, yet not willing to engage. And the question is, what was the Russian side? Above all, I think what we are facing is the failure or crisis of forming a modern Russian identity, either based on an ethnocultural Russian nation or on a civic identity of a Russian national state. And the core of that problem has been what they would see, or many would see, as the Ukrainian issue. That is the inability to give up the idea that Russia must be something greater, and that greater must somehow involve Ukraine. Now, we tend to emphasize Putin and his quite, let's say, poorly written and poorly thought out discussions on Russian-Ukrainian identity. But I think we really should think about this more broadly. And that is, to what degree has the Russian intellectual elite thought about the Ukrainian issue? To what degree it's come to terms with what has happened in the past 150 years? I will not go back to the Middle Ages, but just to look from the mid-19th century and the working of the Ukrainian national movement. In a way, the Ukrainian national movement succeeded in designating where Ukraine would be by its concept of where the border should be. And in a strange way, even the acceptance of that Ukrainian entity as created, at least in the Soviet state in its initial phases. Russia still has not worked out many of these problems. And in some ways, that anger gets directed towards Ukraine. I think Putin may have shocked much of the Russian, particularly the Russian academic and intellectual public now, by having driven this lack of acceptance of Ukraine beyond any bounds of civilized action and by these war crimes. Strangely enough, I then agree with Professor Kravchenko that wars have great influence on nation building. And part of that may be finally for Russia coming to terms with being Russia.
I wanted to say something maybe a little bit simplistic about some issue which is quite complex, but I still would like to make that point because I think that it makes many things clear. And I would like to echo some of the things that Volodymyr was talking about, the deep emotionality about Russians and especially Mr. Vladimir Putin treating the issue of Ukraine and treating the issue of history. It is fundamentally the issue of the very core of the Russian identity. For Mr. Putin's view of history, Ukraine simply cannot exist. And I will give you an example by quoting a very extremely intelligent and prominent American politician who was a diplomat who knew more about Eastern Europe than any other American probably in White House, Zbigniew Brzezinski. And he had two phenomenal quotes. In one quote, he said, Russia cannot be an empire without Ukraine. But then he actually went even further. And he said, without Ukraine, Russia can actually be an empire, but it cannot be Russia. I think this is a phenomenally main point, because really and truly, and in the West, we would say, what does it mean? How it is Russia, isn't it? Well, it's only in name, really, and in a certain convention. And I will go back into the Middle Ages and earlier times. Most people in the West do not think about the fact and don't even realize the fact that the name Russia was never part of what Putin considers the core of his state, Moscow and that area, until 1721, when the Tsar Peter I decided to create an empire. And it was only actually after Ukraine was already partially incorporated into it. It was part of this gathering of the Rus lands. And it was only really at that time that the concept, this grand narrative of the Russian imperial history was being formed, in which Russia is a direct descendant of the medieval polity of Kiev and Rus. And of course, they took the name, before that, they were called Muscovy. They were in no way called Rus in any way. And I can give you this by example, because in the West, we normally think that Kievan Rus, and some people even say Kievan Russia, it was the name for the entire polity that included the place where Moscow later was supposed to be founded. But it was not. When we were working on volume 2 of Rushevsky's history, that was mentioned already twice here, we very, very, very thoroughly went through all of the chronicles. And I can tell you that the name Rus is never used for the environs of Moscow, just the opposite. Normally, when Andrei Bogolubsky, the prince of Vladimir or Suzdal land, he talks about he will write to his brothers to Rus, or Prince says he went to the Novgorod land and then he returned to the Rus. Rus is the name for Kiev in the chronicles, originally named for Kiev, and a fairly small area, I mean, still a sizable area of today's central Ukraine. It was only in the 12th century that Western Ukraine was also, Galicia in Volhynia was also involved, included in the term Rus, with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Belarusian lands were also included in the concept of Rus, but not Moscow, not Novgorod. Even such a Russian historian as Vasily Kluchevsky, imperial Russian historian, he said that the Great Russian, meaning the contemporary Russian, first came into the world stage in the person of Andrei Bogolubsky, which was the end of 12th century. So basically, fundamentally, even based on this imperial historical narrative, Mr. Putin would have to consider that he is not really Russia, that he is something that the history of his state starts in 12th century and has very little to do with Europe until the 18th century. It's part of the Golden Horde for much of the time. It's a completely different intellectual point of view. And as we know, for Mr. Putin, culture and this idea of a great Russian culture is an extremely important sort of marker. I'm very happy that Valery Gurgiev, who is the Putin apologist, was dumped from his Carnegie Hall concert that was taking place this weekend. This shows how Putin and modern Russia uses culture and the idea of this great Russian culture, great civilization, which is based on much of what Ukraine brought into the empire, is so important to him. And that's why if suddenly he would to lose Kiev, suddenly he must deal with a different view of history. And that's why he takes it so extremely personally. He's so emotional about it and ready to go to war, which is going to hurt Russia quite a bit.
Thank you very much for those very, very interesting answers. Moving along, as the world watches in disbelief, many people express their concern about Vladimir Putin's blatant disregard for Ukraine's sovereignty and for the principles of international law. Alexander, could you expand and perhaps express your views on this topic?
Thank you, Tanya. Before we need to probably ask the question, is Russia democracy? And probably you all know that the answer is no. Russia is not democracy. What we see in Russia, that the remnants of the civil society are struggling to survive in the deepest corner of its country. So there is no way for free expressions for ordinary people or for any organizations that resist the Putin's regime. Just before Memorial Organization, the Human Protection Organization, was outlawed, they revealed numbers about how many people right now in Russia are being prosecuted for political or religious views. Simultaneously, around 420 people were charged with just being different and resisting the regime. So it says a lot about what is going on in Russia. Freedom of expression. Just recently, Dmitry Muratov was awarded the prestigious Nobel Prize, and this newspaper has been covering the regime in Russia for decades right now. But what is the cost? Since 2000s, early 2000s, 7 staff journalists have been assassinated. This is a huge number, and it's just only one newspaper that is still trying to resist the regime. And we need to look in comparison also what is going on in Ukraine. Ukraine has made a huge leap towards the democratic values. And it is this threat that it is something what is possible in Russia. And it is the sign to the Russian society that it is something possible to do also within those borders. We know that Russia implemented many laws within the country, like prohibiting LGBT movements, all kind of propaganda, etc. In the last several years, in the center of Kiev, we had LGBTQ parades organized, and it's something what is impossible right now in Russia. So Russia sees that Ukraine is moving really far from what is envisioned in Russia, how society can function. And also it comes to the next question, the question about this sovereignty. What is sovereignty, and how Ukrainians and Ukrainian society and the world understand the concept of sovereignty, and how this concept is understood in Russia. We all know that the concept of sovereignty is based on the rights and protection of territory. It means sovereign territory. On the sovereignty of the society individual sovereignty, when every individual is exercising his or her rights. In Russia, we have completely different concept of sovereignty. The concept of 18th and 19th century meaning of this sovereignty. It is a sovereign ruler. The sovereign ruler that exercises unbelievable rights not only within his own state, but also tries to reach to the neighboring countries, and not only neighboring countries, but also to the most far-reaching countries as US and Canada also. 2016, when Russia's propaganda exercised and also allowed Donald Trump to become a president, it's a good sign how rich can be their exercises. So we need to understand how those two concepts of sovereignty are different right now in Ukraine. Putin sees that Ukraine is already really far. And the war is probably the last option what is left for Putin at this moment. That is why we see how Putin is trying to prevent Ukraine from becoming more democratic, more liberal country. And why it is important for the world to help Ukraine at this moment. Because Ukraine is just a beginning. It's just only beginning. Because we need to look at all speeches that Vladimir Putin just outlined and put to the world. And they are saying not about only Ukraine. They are touching all countries, and also Putin threatened the world with nuclear weaponry. It's something what is really dangerous, and it is a danger pattern that we are seeing that will probably touch all the sovereign nations around the globe. It's not only the problem of Ukraine, it's the problem of the whole democratic society. So Ukraine is just only the country who resisted, because in this case Russia says it does manage to prevail Ukraine for further democratic developments. Russia will face greater consequences, and those consequences are greater than those we are seeing right now inside of Russia.
Thank you, Alexander. So throughout the centuries, we have often seen disinformation affect the view of Ukrainian history, and sometimes even the very concept of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. As academics, we have a responsibility to research and report on factual information. How does the current war impact on the scholarship about Ukraine, and what can the CIUS do about it?
I would like to start with the statement that I am extremely honored and I'm extremely proud of the stand that the Ukrainian armed forces are taking in Ukraine. And I am absolutely confident that Ukraine will come victorious from this war. However, have I not been so sure about that or convinced about that, I would be extremely concerned about the campaign of massive destruction of all of the materials, scholarly materials, archives, libraries, and so on, if Putin would actually be able to get into power and do whatever he would like to do in Ukraine. And I believe that it is, again, the same kind of problem that I mentioned earlier, that it's the question of the identity and of the narrative that excludes Ukraine as a independent cultural or political entity. It is not new to Putin. It was under the Soviets, but it was also under the Imperial Russia. There has been a continuous campaigns of destruction of anything that would suggest that Ukraine had a different kind of history, and especially at a different kind of history before the Pereyaslav Treaty of 1654, before it came into contact with Muscovy and so on. As a student of Ukrainian culture, I am sometimes with great pain in my heart, I am researching the amounts of destruction of Ukrainian art done by, for example, Russian Orthodox Church in the 19th century, not some. The entire tradition of 18th century Ukrainian icon was destroyed. There are very few items left from that tradition, just simply because it was different. It was not falling into what Russia saw as its own Orthodox culture, and everything had to be the way that the Russians, it's Muscovites in any case, wanted to see it. In the 1960s, actually, in one of the questions here, mention about the fire in the early 1960s of the National Library of Ukraine. It was almost certainly an arson, and then the fire brigades were waiting the entire day until the whole section of the ancient Ukrainian manuscripts was burned to ashes. I believe that something very similar would happen in a current situation, and actually we were even alerted about such facts, and Frank was instrumental in helping to save all of the digitized materials of the Institute of History. We were afraid that they will just simply disappear, they can be just erased, and Columbia University graciously agreed to actually save this on their servers. I believe that this war is about history, as we talked about, is about the issue of identity, and it's about the scholarship, about history and about culture. And that's why I think that it is extremely crucial to possibly use this opportunity to maybe shed light on some of these issues of history and culture that otherwise would not gain wider attention because it would be considered as something sort of more narrowly specialist.
If I can just follow up on something, the power of scholarship, and I don't want to overestimate it. But if we look at the late 19th century, the banning of Ukrainian language and of Ukrainian activities in the Russian Empire basically drove those activities across the border into the Habsburg Empire. That is, the attempt to control knowledge and control the Ukrainian movement in a way made it transnational and allowed it to flourish in a new area. And this proved immensely important in the creation of the modern Ukrainian national movement and the first Ukrainian independent states. And then if we look in the Soviet period, the attempt to virtually destroy research on Ukraine at the height of Stalinism, but even in periods after World War II, and to deprive people of access to archives and material, those who lived abroad, but also free access for people within Ukraine. In a certain way, stimulated such activities outside of Ukraine, and certainly were very important in the formation of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies and the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. I don't want to overestimate their later influence, but certainly this was very important for Ukraine today. And I think one of the best advertisements for the Ukrainian state and for scholarship have been the opening of archives in Ukraine. We have seen in the past decade a whole group of specialists in the West who formerly went to Moscow because they wanted to be at the center and deal with archival materials, and were used to the Soviet days as well, when those resources could be used more easily, suddenly redirecting their research to CIUS. And people who initially had no specific interest in Ukraine, now seeing that there is another perspective and way of looking at Soviet history, imperial history, medieval history, other ways, but above all, because Ukraine became an open society. No society is 100% open in its access to material, but certainly Ukraine compares in this way, as in so many other ways, positively as a civic society, an open society compared to Russia. And among those, scholarship, I think, plays a major role in that reorientation.
Before I address this question, I need to also clarify that Putin doesn't actually care about historical facts, and I think he doesn't care about archives when he's putting his messages. He always stresses in his presentations that they are based on open resources, and everyone can check it. But his messages then deconstructed to the small nuggets, and then they deliver to the society, and they are tailored to the specific audiences within the country, within the Russian Federation, and also targeting the West and Ukraine. And they are aiming to produce really a distorted image of Ukraine. First of all, those two images of Ukraine he's producing, and first image is really friendly Ukraine, and the another image is really like enemy of Ukraine. And both of them are actually based on false narratives. And then they are distributed to the audiences. So, and this war started before 2014. And we know how those messages were used by some politicians in Ukraine before 2014. I'm talking about those politicians who aligned with Russia and who disregarded the national interests of Ukraine and then were actually ousted from Ukraine in 2014. This is how Russia's propaganda works. So they are taking the nuggets and they're simplifying the information for the larger audiences. So we are, as academics, we are looking into the deeper nature of those facts. But the regular citizens, they are consuming information completely differently. And it is something as academics we need to take into the consideration. How we are informing the world about Ukraine, how we informing the world about the Russia's disinformation about Ukraine. So because those messages are so simple that Ukraine and Ukrainian nation are not actually existing. So that Ukraine is a Nazi country. And you remember just after the announcement of that speech after Putin made just a week ago, Russia's propaganda produced a map of Ukraine, just saying that the territories of Ukraine just exist because of all kind of presence from all kind of Russia's ruler and using false information. So as a scholars, probably we need to go and think how we are communicating those analytical information in really simple and really digestible way, but on the concrete information, just providing information and links to open resources. Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies has encyclopedia project with numerous articles about Ukraine and also Ukraine-Russia relations and all kind of regions and movements that we have had on our territory. We have the Forum for Ukrainian Studies that is trying to analyze the situation in Ukraine from analytical perspective, from the view of sociology, politology, and other disciplines. But as a scholars, we need to also think about the broader audience, and it's probably the next step that we will be as a scholar thinking.
Thank you, Alexander. The next question, we must also address the impact that this new massive invasion of Ukraine by Russia has on civil society. Natalia?
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you, my colleagues, on your reflections on the key issues which are affecting or informing the conflict. And if I can actually change it a little bit and speak of civil society more in terms of its being a powerful force, which actually is one of the pillars of democracy, of threat to Mr. Putin. Putin is threatened first and above all by democracy and democratic evolvement in Ukraine. And democracy, of course, translates into all the important developments we've been reflecting on today. It's about plurality of views. It's about access to alternative narratives of history. It's about dialogue and eventually about reconciliation of various perspectives on history. And this is what is happening and taking place in Ukraine. And this is obviously is of threat to the Russian Federation. But if I come back to democracy and to a question Tanya has asked me about civil society, in my opinion, it is an important factor to consider, which is also undermining the efforts of Mr. Putin in installing his particular view and vision on the world of what is Ukraine to be in the next while as he goes his huge assault to that. And it does bring us back to this time frame of the last 30 plus years. It gives us the perspective of what exactly happened to Ukrainian society after 1991. And also it reminds us of what Ukrainians have been deprived of while they were under the yoke of Soviet Union. We know very well that the Soviet system has stamped out really all the pre-existing forms and means of staying involved in Ukrainian society, be they in the rural sector, be they in the urban sector, and throughout the history of Soviet Union, civic society, civil society did not have a right to exist. With the collapse of the system in 1991, the Ukrainian society was gradually emerging from that particular context and any effort to build and reconstitute itself along the lines of how other societies have done it in the democratic world. If you look around the world and you consider yet again, what is civic society? What is this sector, volunteer sector? Take volunteerism, for example, it presenting itself as a driving, powerful force in the democracy context, which oftentimes goes hand in hand with other powerful institutions on the ground. It is called the third sector, not for no simple reason. It is in a way positioned in terms of what it can achieve and can partner with governments and industrial or business sector. And of course, if you look around the value or the financial dimension to this powerful force, which is, driving democracy forward around the world, it is extremely endowed with also financial wealth. All this is on the go and growth in Ukraine. We know very well that slow motion has been very much characterizing this involvement, but we also have seen dramatic developments in Ukraine. Go back to the Euromaidan in 2004, fast forward to 2014. These are the key points at which we've seen, and scholars have commented on, the accelerated growth in the spread in constitution of exactly civic society in Ukraine. Back in 2014, general population has embraced the notion of volunteerism and had grew and had become eventually, over the course of last 8 years of war, into a strong sector, third sector in Ukraine. And again, there is important statistical dimensions to that and important fiscal dimensions to that. And ultimately, this particular part of Ukrainian democracy is off threat to the Russian Federation as it is constituted now. I'd like also to remind us that in the last 30 years in Ukraine, we have seen two generations coming of age, the millennials and the Generation Z. Those are your members of those memory communities we're very much concerned with as Ukrainians, as historians or scholars in social sciences and humanities. Those are the individuals who have embraced not only the memories of Soviet period, and those, of course, have been addressed very differently in Ukraine versus how it has been handled and controlled in Russian Federation. Those are the individuals who now have built their identities on the basis of what they lived personally through in the last independent years of Ukraine. Those are the people who are very different from, again, the populations of youth and millennials and Zennies in the neighboring country of Russian Federation. So just to remind everybody, if we speak of civil society, we also are reminded, coming back to sovereignty and democracy questions, of the society which advances and very much embraces the notion of civic identity. And the more of a threat we've seen coming from the East, the more push for that particular civic identity we have been seeing on the ground unfolding. This is a very brief reflection. We know the issue is far more complex, and stay with CIUS as we will be unfolding and unraveling those dimensions for you later in our sessions, and we'll speak about those later. Thank you, Tanya.
Now, Volodymyr, there's another question posed in the chat. Why invade Ukraine now? What happened since Zelensky was elected that has heightened the threat of Ukraine to Russia?
Many of you noticed that in 2014, Putin's invasion and Putin's campaign against Ukraine started almost on the same day, 23rd of February, right? Those of you who knows the background, the context of this very special day would understand that this is the official Soviet celebration of the Soviet Army and Navy. So it's charged with some symbolic issue. Speaking of why he didn't decide to invade Ukraine before, I do believe that he was hoping that Mr. Zelensky, who is native to Donbass, Russian-speaking, who was a frequent visitor to Russia, he would be the same as or a copy or imitation of Yanukovych. And when he understood, I mean, President Putin understood that this is not going to happen, he decided, and once again, it's after the Olympic Games, and once again, it's the 23rd of February, that's my understanding of this. But who knows, maybe after 100 or 1,000 years or so, Russian archives will be available for the next generation of scholars and etc., and so on and so forth.
I would add just two other possibilities. Well, one that's frequently mentioned, of course, is the election of Biden and not Trump as president of the US, at least as a foreground for this, to what role that would have played, an issue that feeling that nothing would be accomplished with the Biden administration, even though there were attempts. And the other one that I wonder much about, and maybe archives someday will tell us, But is Belarus not important in this? Was not the shock that quiescent Belarus, that everyone thought was so totally in hand, suddenly could have mass civic demonstrations against Lukashenko? And is that in a way, we don't call it clearly one of the color revolutions, it didn't come to an end, but was this not a way to say, no, this must be brought totally in hand and Ukraine must be brought in hand? So
I'd like us to go back to the context of a global security crisis overall. Think what happened to Afghanistan and what decisions the West has adopted vis-a-vis the conflict there. Think about the end of COVID, or hopefully the end of COVID coming up. Think about the weakened European Union and think about the new presidencies as they are in the United States. I think they geopolitically, if I can speculate, these are also the important factors to keep in mind. Why now? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Vladimir, can you comment on the historical significance of the Dnipro River as a border and or divide?
Very interesting. I like symbolic geography. I used to toy with symbolically, geographically, historically charged, issues, and I myself am from the Russian-Ukrainian borderland. Historically, Ukraine during the Cossack Wars was divided between Poland and Russia along the Dnipro River. Believe me or not, the integrity of Ukrainian historical, ethnic, cultural territory never disappeared from the radar of Ukrainian elites since the end of the 17th century. And imagined Ukraine in geographical terms, Ukraine from the Carpathian Mountains to the Don River. So that's the significance. In terms of geopolitics, it can divide Ukraine. In terms of national identity, Dnipro is the very symbol of Ukrainianness, of Ukrainian identity. The same way as, for example, Volga is a symbol of Russian identity. Wisla in Poland, Mississippi, Sava, Rhine, and so on and so forth. That's my brief comments.
Thank you. I would like to take this opportunity then to thank all of our panelists for their insights. And I would like to also thank our CIUS communications lead, Andrea Kupilic, who co-organized this event. We would all like to thank you who joined us today. Please submit your questions to us. You will find the email address in the chat. These questions will help us develop a plan for our next roundtable conversations.
I would like to thank my colleagues for finding time to quickly join and organize this very important panel. I would like all the attendees to remember that we're here to continue on this dialogue and this conversation with you. We are very much interested in addressing general public, the media. We are here to help you answer questions about why and for what reasons. As academics, as we're well equipped to engage with the subject matter on a variety of topics. And I am looking forward and inviting you to follow us on social media on our website in order to find out when the next seminars are going to be hosted. Our seminars, our roundtables, are now being redesigned to address the crisis in the world, in Europe in particular, in Ukraine more particular. We will be engaging with different constituencies, different voices, different groups, communities, nations, in order for all of us to unravel why and for what reasons and where it might go from now. Thank you very much. Stay tuned.